Welcome back to week 5. This week we'll be looking at various chapters dealing with population, and we will be covering chapters 10 through 12. First off, for this week, your readings and the sections that we'll cover in lecture are chapter 10, sections 10.1 and 10.4, chapter 11, section 11.3, and chapter 12, sections 12.1 and 12.2. For chapter 10, we're going to be looking at how dispersal can change population densities, how understanding age distribution is important to understanding future population health and growth, and looking at how dispersal rates of trees compared to doves and honeybees. For chapter 11, we'll be looking at the density dependent and density independent limits to population growth. We'll be looking at how finch populations vary with rainfall and why. And for chapter 12, we'll be looking at an example of the principle of allocation, describing the relationship between fish egg size and genetic diversity, and explaining the different modes of plant dispersal. And lastly, describing the relationship between seed size and how plants survive. So first off, let's look at chapter 10 on population dynamics. Section 10.1 deals with dispersal, and this is how organisms move from one area to another. And their textbook gives an example of Africanized honeybees. And honeybees evolved in Africa and Europe and have since differentiated into many locally adapted subspecies. And so a subspecies is essentially, there's still honeybees. This subspecies can all mate with each other and produce offspring, but they're just slightly different. So slightly different traits, but still that same species, Apis mellifera. Africanized honeybees are hybrids of European honeybees, and they're an African subspecies. They disperse much faster than the European honeybees do. Within 30 years, they've occupied most of South America, Mexico, and all of Central America. Here's a chart that's in your text, and it shows the dispersal of where the Africanized honeybees started from and where they've moved to. So here was their point here in Brazil where they started in 1957. By 1966, they had spread out this far, 1971 this far, and again, you're looking at all of South America here. So you're looking at a pretty big region where they dispersed in just a matter of not too many years. And then you can see their dispersals moved up and up and up and up through Central America. And your text states that cold winter temperatures will likely halt the northern spread of Africanized honeybees. So they're not likely to move into too much of North America, or the United States, just because it gets too cold in the winters and it would kill off the populations. They also haven't gone any further south, likely due to the cooler temperatures in winter there as well. So dispersal can increase or decrease local population densities, and so species can either move into or out of the area. And if a species moves into an area, that's called emigration with an I. So immigration. As species move out of an area into a new area, that's called emigration with an E. So into an area with an I, out of an area with an E. Dispersal is one of the least studied aspects of populations, in part because it often involves the movement of extremely small seeds, larvae, etc. over large areas. So it's a hard thing to study when you're looking at things moving far distances that are really, really tiny. So if you think of a plant seed moving, being blown in the wind, it can move a really long distance, and it's hard to track where those things move. There are ways to do that. It's just not it's not something that's highly studied. Expanding populations are one of the best sources of information on dispersal. So if you look at, instead of trying to look at where the seeds went or the larva of something, looking at where you see the population pop up. Another example in this chapter are the collared doves, and collared doves spread from Turkey into Europe after 1900. Dispersal began suddenly. It was not influenced by humans, and it took place in small jumps. So they moved approximately 45 kilometers per year. And a 1970s introduction of collared doves into Barbados also led to rapid dispersal. They reached Florida by the 1980s and spread across North America and reached California by the mid-1990s. So here we can see the spread of the collared doves through Europe, and this doesn't show their American spread, but it shows their European spread. And as you can see here, their population in 1900 in Turkey, and then by 1910 they were this far into Europe, 20, 30, 40, 50. And you can see their spread to 1990 in basically all the reaches of Europe here. Organisms began to spread northward about 16,000 years ago following the retreat of glaciers and a warming climate. So climate has a lot to do with where species can go, especially when there's a major ice age or some major climate change that limits where most organisms can live. So there's evidence found preserved in pollen and lake sediments that the dispersal rate of trees is about 100 to 400 meters per year. And tree dispersal rate comparable to that of large mammals is about 1/100th the rate of collared doves and 1,000th the rate of Africanized honeybees. And what this shows us is that plants, due mainly to the fact that they can't pick up and move voluntarily, they have to be either carried off by an animal or blown by the wind or carried in water, they spread out at a much slower rate than animals that can move do. And the more things easily they can move, like bees can move very quick, can travel a very far distance, even compared to the doves. So the more quickly something can move, the faster it will colonize and spread out or disperse. So here is a chart of the movement of maple here on the left. Reached its northeastern part of its present range about 6,000 years ago. So we have starting down here. So after the ice age, as it got warmer and warmer, it was able to spread further and further north. So essentially the ice from the ice age is retreating and moving north, and the plant is moving north with that. But it again can't move as fast as, say, a mammal or an insect or an animal that can actually move. You can see the hemlock didn't reach its present range until just 2,000 years ago. So the maple spread a little bit faster, hemlock had a little slower spread. So it depends on how well seeds are carried and various other factors as to how fast plants can spread. Now, dispersal can also be not just whether something is able to move, but also if their food supply moves, then something might follow, an animal might follow that food supply and disperse in response to the changing food supply. So in this study mentioned in your text by Holling, they observed numerical responses to increased prey availability. And essentially the increased prey density led to an increased density of predators. And so all that's really saying is that if there's a lot to eat, the prey, then the amount of predators that eat that prey also will increase. So if your food source goes up, you're going to be able to go up too in numbers. Individuals moved into new areas in response to higher prey densities. So when there was more food to eat, they moved to that area to get more of that food. Things can also disperse fairly rapidly in water, and one way that things can move is through rivers and streams, and stream dwellers have mechanisms to allow them to maintain their stream position. And they can have streamlined bodies, they can be bottom dwelling, they can be able to stick to surfaces. They tend to get washed downstream in what they call spates. And so this is just maybe a flood or something comes through and washes down a larger amount of a particular organisms than would normally be moved down. So typically organisms are going to stay through various techniques here in the area where they were born, and they'll live close to that area. But occasionally they do get washed downstream rapidly. And this study by Mueller hypothesized that populations are maintained via a dynamic interplay between downstream and upstream dispersal. And so organisms can move downstream, organisms can move upstream, but they tend to move a little up and a little down and stay generally in a fairly stable area. This figure here from your text is just showing that organisms, let's say they live somewhere in the center here, are going to tend to, with the flow of water, drift a little bit naturally downstream. Most organisms tend to have some kind of way of moving upstream to compensate for the downstream drift. So rather than just constantly spending their whole life being floated downstream and eventually out to sea, they tend to drift down a little bit and then have some way to move back upstream. Section 10.4 looks at age distribution, and by studying factors like how well an organism is able to survive, reproduce, and how quickly they can grow, gives us an idea of how the population numbers will look in the future. And a study by Miller looked at age distribution in white oak, and they looked at the relationship between age and trunk diameter and to age the trees. And they found an age distribution bias towards younger trees. So what that means is that there were more younger trees than older trees. And by having more younger trees than older trees, there was sufficient reproduction for replacement. And so if you had exactly the same number of younger and older trees, the population would likely go down over time just because some of those younger trees will die. But if you have more younger than older, then the population was actually able to stay fairly stable over time. A chart from your text on the percentage of white oak trees in each age category. So this 0 to 50, 50 to 100, 100 to 150. And as you can see, there's the most amount of trees, over 60% of the trees were in this age bracket. 100%, or sorry, a little over 20% of the trees were up to 100 years old, and decreasing down to just a few percent that were around 300 years old. And so what's happening is that this large amount of young trees, as time goes on, some of them die off, and only a certain percentage live to be this old, and it decreases over time. But the population of each age category in this example stayed fairly constant over time. Again, because there's enough young to replace the old, even with the die-off and other things. Another study was on cottonwood populations and shows an example of population that's declining, and the old trees are not being replaced, so there are not enough young trees to replace the old trees. And reproduction rates, reproduction depends on seasonal floods in the species, and the floods prepare the seed bed, and so if they don't get these seasonal floods, then it doesn't prepare the seed beds, and the seeds cannot grow. So the nursery areas, or where the trees need to grow when they're first seedlings, needs to be moist. And now in this area the floods have decreased, and so now there are fewer germination areas, which is leading to the population. Study by Grant and Grant on the finches in the Galapagos Islands showed how climate can influence the number of species. And so there was a drought in 1977, and that resulted in no new finches being born in those years. And so there was a gap in the age distribution. So there were some that were born before 1977, but then none born during that year of 1977, or very few. And then some born then between 1977 and 1984, but then another drought in 1984 and 1985 led to, again, a drop in the population. On the other hand, there was a great year in 1983, and this led to higher reproductive output, or a lot of finches born during that year. So essentially, if it's a good year, kind of makes common sense here. If it's a good year, then there's going to be a lot of organisms born, whatever is good for that organism. And if it's a bad year, then there won't be as many of that organism born. And responsiveness of population age structure to environmental variation just shows us that if we'll see how many of the organism there are at different ages correspond to the environmental condition. Next study here by Bruno and Bauer looks at a mountain-dwelling snail, and this snail tends to have reduced reproduction when the temperature gets at or above 22 degrees Celsius. And so the warmer it gets above that temperature, then this snail is not going to reproduce. And they were hypothesizing that the climate warming was going to affect the distribution of the snail. And so they looked at historical distributions in 1916 to 17, and they compared that to current distribution. So they looked at where it lived about 100 years ago and then where it lived now. And they found that as time went on and the environment became warmer over the last 100 years, that the average elevation of snail populations has shifted upwards. And essentially the snail is just moving up in elevation to get to where it's cooler. And so they're not surviving down low. So the only place they survive is higher up. And so eventually their population has moved higher and higher up into the mountains. And there have been a lot of other studies that have documented the same thing, that species will tend to either move north or up in elevation as temperature increases. Like, for example, the mountain goat that likes to live far north or high up in the mountains. And next we move on to chapter 11 on population growth. So the first section we're going to look at in chapter 11 is section 11.3, limits to population growth. And the environment limits population growth by altering birth and death rates. So as you can imagine, if there are a lot of births, then your population is going to increase. If there are a lot more deaths, then your population is going to decrease if deaths are more than births. There are some what they call density dependent factors that alter the birth and death rates. These are disease and resource competition, and density dependent factors are things that are influenced by how dense the population is, how many species of that organism are living in one area. So if there's a whole lot of species crowded into one area, diseases are more likely, and there's also a lot more competition over resources such as food and water and shelter. And the less dense an area is, there will be less chance of disease and less competition for resources. There are also density independent factors, and these are things that don't have to do with how dense a population is, like a natural disaster or weather. Let's look back at our example of the Galapagos finch population change. And this was an example, if you remember, in drought years, the finches didn't do as good, and in years with good rainfall, they did better. So this would be a density independent change. So rainfall does not have anything to do with how dense the population is. And after the drought in 1977, the population fell to about 180 birds, and the food plants failed to produce seed crop. On the other hand, in 1983, there was 10 times the normal amount of rainfall, which caused the population to grow to about 1,100 due to the abundance of seeds and caterpillars. So this here shows, the green line shows the number of finches over the years, and the blue line shows the rainfall over the years. So as you can see, the amount of rainfall and the number of finches, there's a high correlation between those two values. So as the rainfall goes up, finch population goes up. And the rainfall here stayed fairly steady. Rainfall stayed fairly steady. Number of finches stayed fairly steady. And then in the year when the rainfall shot up significantly, the number of finches also shot up significantly. So again, rainfall would be an example of density, a density independent factor. Next, we are going to look at chapter 12, covering life histories. And a life history is looking at an organism and how it changes throughout its life or its life cycle. And so, for example, I'll note the example of how a butterfly first has an egg, and that changes to a larva and a pupa, and then eventually you get the butterfly. And same thing with a frog, probably learned about frog eggs going into tadpoles, and then that slowly changing into the frog. So these life cycles are what we call life history. And we'll look at in this chapter how life history influences population. So first chapter, section 12.1 looks at offspring number versus size. And the principle of allocation states that if organisms use energy for one function, such as growth, the amount of energy available for other functions is reduced. So essentially you only have so much energy that can go to so many things. So if you're using a lot of your energy to grow, then you're not going to have as much energy for other things. This leads to trade-offs between functions, such as number and size of offspring. Next, we're going to look at how offspring size and number influences a population. And a good way to look at this, a good species we can look at are fish, and they show a huge variation in their life history compared to other groups of animals. So for example, fish can have just 1 to 2 offspring at a time in the sharks, whereas other species of fish, such as the sunfish, can have up to 600 million eggs at a time. Now, a study by Turner and Trexler wanted to see how egg size and egg number influence gene flow or movement of genes in a population. And what they found is that if a species has many small eggs, then if you look at all the organisms in a certain region, they tend to be very similar. So if a species lays a lot of small eggs, there's a lot of mixing of genes within a population, and the organisms all tend to be very similar. If you have an organism that has a small number of large eggs, then the organisms throughout a region tend to be very different. And this is because there's not as much intermixing of genes and not as many organisms, not as much reproduction going on to mix up those genes. So if you have a lot of small eggs, then organisms tend to be all very similar. If you have very few large eggs, then the organisms tend to be very different. We can also look at seed size and number in plants and how this influences the population. Plants show a broad range of seed production, ranging from having many small seeds to a few large seeds. So just like the fish, plant seed size and number can vary by a large amount as well. 2 factors may influence seed size and production. This is the plant growth form and its dispersal mode. Let's make that chart a little bit bigger here. And what we see here is that the plant growth form tends to correspond to seed size. And so graminoid plants or grasses tend to have the smallest seeds, and forbs or green plants, similar size. As you move into your woody plants, you get larger seeds, and the climbing plants, like climbing vines, tend to have the largest seeds. Now, also, if you look at dispersal mode, organisms that do not have anything else assisting their dispersal, so they're just fall to the ground, tend to have the very smallest seeds. Organisms that rely on the wind for dispersal, their seeds are fairly small as well. Organisms that stick to something else and get moved by sticking to something have a little bit bigger seeds, and all the way up to if organisms are dispersed by like a vertebrate, so they're moved by an animal, they have to be a little bit bigger to attract an animal, either to eat them or to stick to the animal. And so the type of plant here, whether it's a grass or woody plant or climber, and the dispersal modes, whether it's dispersed by wind or by insects or by vertebrates, these things all correspond to the seed size and seed number that a plant will produce. Now, Westaby and people in that study looked at 4 different plant forms. They looked at graminoids or grass-like plants, forbs, which are herbaceous plants, so plants that are small and green, not woody, but also not grasses. They looked at woody plants, which means they have if you think of something with wood, they have some woody thickening to their stems. And then they also looked at climbers, like climbing plants and vines. And woody plants and climbers, as you saw on the chart, produce 10 times the mass of seeds than either the graminoids or the forbs. So their seeds were about 10 times larger. They looked at 6 different dispersal strategies: unassisted, so no specialized structures; adhesion, so they have some kind of hooks, spines, or barbs; they blow in the wind through either wings or hair; carried by ants; carried by vertebrates; or scatter-hoarded, which means they're gathered and stored in caches. So if you think of animals who will collect a whole bunch of seeds and store them, that would be scatter-hoarded. So small plants that produce a large number of small seeds appear to have an advantage in areas with a lot of disturbance. Plants that produce large seeds are constrained to producing fewer seedlings, but are more capable of surviving environmental hazards. They might not come back as quickly after a disturbance, but they're more likely to survive the disturbance. If we look at animals, vertebrate energy budgets are different before and after sexual maturity. So before a vertebrate reaches sexual maturity, their energy is mainly spent on maintenance or growth, so getting bigger. After sexual maturity, their energy is divided between maintenance, so just maintaining their current body, some growing, and reproduction. Individuals that delay reproduction will grow faster and reach a larger size and have an increased reproduction rate. This study with snakes and lizards showed that those with higher survival rates also reached their age of maturity later. So the age at which you mature also can correspond to your survival rate. And they found that fish with higher adult mortality showed higher reproductive rates. So if it's likely that the adults are going to die very easily or quickly, then they tend to reproduce faster so they can reproduce and have offspring before they die. And lastly here, this study looked at the influence of adult survival on pumpkin seed sunfish, and they found that when adult survival is lower relative to juvenile survival, natural selection will favor giving greater amount of their resources to reproduction. So if it's not very likely that they're going to survive when they get older, they're going to put a lot of their resources into just making sure that they can reproduce and make offspring before they die. That is the end of our week 5 lecture. Just want to say keep up the great work. Everybody overall is doing a great job at getting things turned in. I know the quarter gets busy as we move into kind of the heart of the quarter, but keep up the great work. You're halfway through the quarter, so moving along here. And as always, let me know if you have any questions as you go through doing your work throughout the week. Thanks, and I will be in touch with you again next week.